our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hi, Truth Seekers. I'm glad to see you this week. In today's episode, we're going to practice noticing a thinking problem that relates to both calling someone a rhino and to cancel culture. And then, my guest this week has some fascinating research about an influential religious perspective that's actually hiding in plain sight, but it shows up in things like that white flag with the pine tree on it that has been flown at homes owned by justices. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Before we get going, a special thank you to Alita P. Alita took the time last week to write to me at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com with a great topic for discussion. I'd also like to thank Tennessee Groove for their thoughtful review on Apple Podcasts. I really love hearing what you're thinking about, Truth Seekers, and it helps me to know what topics you want to hear about. So, have you ever seen someone get canceled online for something they said? Maybe it was a joke that wasn't funny or a comment that was taken out of context. It can be something pretty innocuous, like assuming the gender of a fictional cartoon character who's ambiguous, or it could be something really bad, like assuming someone in real life doesn't speak a language. But whatever the reason is, the internet can be a pretty unforgiving place. You know, sometimes anger can be justified, but is that dramatic pile-on really helping anything? The outrage over these kind of incidents can make us wonder, are we being too quick to act? And are we falling prey to a particular kind of faulty thinking? Well, today, we're going to talk about a common logical fallacy that can lead us to make really rash judgments and just stop talking. It's called the appeal to purity fallacy, and it's something we should all know about, especially in the age of social media and kind of instant outrage. It's a lot easier to spot in people we disagree with, but people from all kinds of perspectives fall prey to it. Have a listen.
Welcome to All Things Scottish. If it's no Scottish, it's crap! Can I help you?
Do you have family tartans?
Oh, aye, we do, hen. And what's your family's name?
Grotowski?
Grotowski. Oh, the Grotowski tartan. From the Voyahojits clan of tartans, I suppose. Now get out!
Now, another name for the appeal to purity is the no true Scotsman fallacy. And that clip is a great example from Saturday Night Live of the no true Scotsman fallacy in action. It's essentially a way of saying, if you don't agree with me 100%, then you're just not on the team. You know, if it isn't Scottish, it's crap. It's like setting a high, super high standard for what it means to be part of a group, and then using that standard to exclude anyone who doesn't meet it. This fallacy can be dangerous because it shuts down any possibility of dialogue or understanding, and it just makes an us versus them mentality. And then we can't really talk about stuff anymore. So how does this play out in politics today? Let's look at a couple of examples. Imagine a school board is debating whether or not to ban a book from the school library. I know you've probably seen videos of angry parents behind microphones at board meetings, a scenario that's really been played out around the United States. And maybe the book they're fighting about deals with a family with two dads, and some religious parents are upset about it because it goes against those parents' religious beliefs. But they argue that the book shouldn't be in the library at all because it's inappropriate for young children. And they say, no good parent would want their child exposed to this kind of material. This is an example of an appeal to purity. The parents are setting a very biased standard for what it means to be a good parent. They're claiming that anyone who doesn't agree with their perspective is not a good parent, ignoring the fact that the children in the school likely come from all kinds of families. This kind of thinking shuts down any possibility of having a nuanced conversation about the issue, because now you're not talking about whether or not the book is appropriate for young children. You're talking about whether or not you agree with the parent's definition of what a good parent is. Or try this one on for size. Let's say you're listening to a lawmaker who believes that all life begins at conception, and because of this, that lawmaker opposes abortion in all cases and for all people, even for people who don't share their beliefs. And, even sitting in the pew with them on a Sunday might be a problem. Someone who struggled with infertility and is seeking in vitro fertilization. If you ask the lawmaker, he's going to say IVF has to be illegal. He'd say, because IVF creates embryos that are never implanted, and those embryos are human life, you can't support IVF and say you're pro-life. And again, that's an appeal to purity fallacy. That person is setting a massive standard for what it means to be pro-life. They're saying if you don't oppose IVF, then you're not truly pro-life. And this kind of thinking ignores the complexities and shuts down the possibility of having a productive conversation. Because in this case, you're no longer talking about whether life begins at conception. You're talking about whether or not you agree with the specifics of their definition of what it means to be pro-life. So let's listen to some real-life examples.
Don't take my word for it. Progressive Democrats this week were crowned the villains by the master of horror himself, Stephen King, who in his newer avatar as a #resistance liberal activist tweeted this week, quote, "Memo to progressives, 70% of something is better than 100% of nothing. The electorate is watching you squabble like children in the playground." Maybe, just maybe, it's time for Stephen King to give the political commentary a rest and stick to the novel writing. For a start, it's important to remember this is $3.5 trillion over 10 years that they're trying to get through Congress. And it's already a compromise. Bernie Sanders said just months ago that he wanted, and the climate needs, $6 trillion over 10 years. So if we're looking for a 70% compromise, as Stephen King suggests, we've already cleared that. $3.5 trillion is already less than 60% of what Sanders and the left were asking for.
That was Mehdi Hassan back when he worked for MSNBC. And notice what he did to Stephen King in this clip. He says King is claiming to be a #resistance liberal activist, but that King needs to sit down because he's suggesting compromising. There's a little bit of an extra logic issue in here as well, because Hassan gives an example of not agreeing with Bernie Sanders on a number for climate change. And climate change is super important, but I don't know that everyone would support the notion that in order to be progressive, you must accept what Bernie Sanders says. No room for nuance here. Let's listen to another example.
King George's men weren't ready to fight people who were ready to fight for a concept, for a belief, for an idea unseen, for a nation unseen. He wasn't ready for that. And in a lot of ways, that's what's wrong with our country right now. We've become so highfalutin and so educated, and we got Google, so we don't need God anymore. So we've forgotten our founding ideas, forgotten who we are, forgotten the concepts that we're fighting for. And because we now find ourselves struggling with people who have evil intents. There was a time when we used to meet evil on the battlefield, and guess what we did to it? We killed it. We didn't quibble about it. We didn't argue about it. We didn't fight about it. We killed it. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, what did we do? We flew to Japan. And we killed the Japanese Army and Navy. We didn't even quibble about it. I didn't start this fight. You did. You wanted to be left alone. You should have left me alone. We didn't argue and capitulate and talk about, well, maybe we shouldn't fight the Nazis that hard. No, they're bad. Kill them. Some liberal somewhere is going to say that sounds awful. Too bad. Get mad at me if you want to. Some folks need killing.
That was North Carolina Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson speaking in a church service the weekend before Independence Day in the United States. Robinson is running for governor presently. In his talk, he's talking about founding ideals for the country. He says, quote, "We've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten the concept we are fighting for," end quote. Now, earlier in his talk, Robinson tried to make an argument that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation. And if you want to hear that whole argument, I'll put a link to the whole speech in the show notes. But anyway, he sets up the things that he believes were the founding values as the good, the purity, and anything that disagrees with it as the evil. And then he goes on and gives a World War II example of Japanese and Nazis not being tolerated, and he extends that to the disagreement today with those values that he's set up, right? If you disagree with the Christian nation values that he believes were the way the country was founded, then you can't be tolerated either. So killing the evil becomes, quote, "a matter of necessity." This is also an appeal to purity. Appeals to purity are common religious arguments because people who adhere to different faiths think that they have the real answers and that there's some kind of supernatural order that they need to guard. When I come back, my uninterrupted interview with Dr. Matt Taylor, who has spent years studying one such group, will be really interesting. But I'll be back soon. Welcome back. Dr. Matt Taylor is the Protestant scholar at the Institute of Islamic Christian Jewish Studies. His podcast series, Charismatic Revival Fury, the New Apostolic Reformation, tells about how networks of extremist Christian leaders kind of helped start the January 6th insurrection, and it's really fascinating. I definitely recommend a listen. His next book, The Violent Take It by Force, The Christian Movement That's Threatening Our Democracy, is going to be published this fall. Matt, welcome to Unspun.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you this time. I really enjoyed your podcast, and I've enjoyed some of your documentaries as well. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and the first one was about the term strategic spiritual warfare. So can you tell me what that means?
So spiritual warfare, more general term or concept, is the idea that's very popular with a lot of parts of Christianity, evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, some parts of Catholicism, that the idea is that there are angels and demons battling in this invisible cosmic warfare all around humanity, battling for control of the earth, battling for the forces of God, right? And that spiritual warfare refers to the ways that Christians believe they can participate in that warfare through prayer, through worship, through different forms of Christian devotion. On the more kind of radical end would be activities like exorcisms, or what's sometimes referred to in Pentecostal and charismatic circles as deliverance ministry. So casting demons out of people, casting demons out of buildings. So that's all pretty standard in American Christianity. You'll find tens of millions of American Christians who believe in spiritual warfare, who practice spiritual warfare, but it's usually pretty much constrained at an individual or communal level, kind of casting out my personal demons or your personal demons, delivering our church from oppression, that sort of thing. What in the 1990s, this set of leaders around a renegade evangelical seminary professor named C. Peter Wagner really started kind of ramping up these spiritual warfare paradigms. Some of this goes back earlier, but it really kind of crystallizes around Wagner. And Wagner is the one who coins this term, strategic level spiritual warfare. And Wagner believed, and he was very tied up with modern day prophets who he believed could hear directly from God and see into this spiritual realm. So he believed that in the book of Ephesians, in the New Testament, there's this kind of vague reference to principalities and powers of the air that seemingly are these kind of malign spiritual forces. It's not very clear in the text. Well, Wagner believed that these were what he called territorial spirits, as in kind of high-level demons that hold sway over literal physical territory, and that you could actually map geographically the domain of these territorial spirits, right? That it's not like a separate world of spiritual versus physical, but that there's literal territory and literal human institutions that are possessed by demons. And so when he talks about strategic level spiritual warfare, the idea is certain people, and because Wagner believes in modern day apostles and prophets and thinks he's a modern day apostle, he believes that apostles and prophets have special authority to do this strategic level spiritual warfare, identify by name these territorial spirits, and then mobilize campaigns of Christians to pray in a synchronized way against those territorial spirits so as to displace them, so that the church can expand and that territory can become Christian. And that there would be revivals that would break out when these territorial spirits are displaced. And they very much attach these ideas to things like abortion. And they would say that abortion is a form of occult child sacrifice that gives power to demons. And so part of the strategies that they're developing, they're developing, and they would really use this terminology, a spiritual arsenal with weapons like shofars that they believe, that, again, these ram's horns that are that come out of Jewish ritual practice, but they believe that shofars are weapons of spiritual warfare, that if you blow the shofar, that sound resonates in heaven and God dispatches angels in response. Or
They would also use prophetic and apostolic decrees and declarations. They'll do certain ceremonies to displace these territorial spirits. And they believe the apostles and prophets are endowed by God with authority to both guide these campaigns and to be boots on the ground to cast out the territorial spirits. And this becomes very, very important for understanding January 6th, because a lot of the Christian manifestations on display around the Capitol on January 6th are manifestations of this strategic spiritual warfare paradigm.
Okay, I've got 2 follow-up questions then. So the first question is, when you're talking about angels and demons and those kind of things, they believe that those are like literally beings that exist. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, and beings that have names, beings that that if you know their names, you have a certain power over them. And there are certain names that kind of always recur in circles. Jezebel, the Jezebel spirit, is a very common idea they'll talk about. There was a lot of talk about Jezebel and the Jezebel spirit leading up to January 6th. They'll talk about the spirit of Leviathan. Sometimes the demons have more idiosyncratic names. And again, it's the prophets that they believe can see into the spirit realm, identify these spirits. And once you can identify a spirit, then you can cast it out. But again, using these strategies and using the authority of the apostles and prophets.
Okay, so here's my second question then. Where do apostles and prophets come from? How do you know if you are one?
So the idea really gets started in charismatic circles around the 1950s with a movement called the Latter Rain, or the New Order of the Latter Rain. It was a Pentecostal revival movement that was very fixated on the book of Ephesians. If you notice that especially for Wagner, Wagner leads a set of networks called the New Apostolic Reformation. These folks are very interested. Ephesians becomes in some ways the canon within the canon. And in Ephesians chapter 4, so Ephesians chapter 6 is where we find a lot of this language of spiritual warfare, the armor of God, principalities and powers. In Ephesians chapter 4, the author of Ephesians writes about Jesus giving the church 5 gifts of leadership and names them as apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And so this gives rise to a philosophy of church governance, a theology of church governance called fivefold ministry, because there's 5 of these offices or roles that are named. And part of what the Latter Rain folks in the 1950s and then Peter Wagner in the 1990s, what they're latching onto is they're saying, you know, in most forms of Christianity today, we have evangelists, we have pastors, we have teachers. What about the apostles and prophets? Why have those styles of leadership from the early church, why have those died out? And they come to believe that God wants to renew those forms of leadership. And that and Wagner even calls the time we're living in now, starting in 2001, the second apostolic age, as in God is commissioning it, and they believe that we're living at the end of time, and that this is a kind of great outpouring of the Holy Spirit to commission new apostles and prophets, and then dispatch them to revolutionize the governance of the church and really revolutionize the world. And so the apostles and prophets concept comes out of this fivefold ministry. Sometimes if you hear fivefold ministry, they're really talking about apostles and prophets there. And these ideas become very, very popular in what is called the independent charismatic world, or the non-denominational charismatic world. Charismatic, we're just talking about a form of Christian spirituality that is focused on recapturing the supernatural dimensions of early Christianity. And the idea of new apostles and prophets is very much a part of that, recapturing the supernatural ethos of the early church.
Okay. And just to kind of get an idea of scope, I know you said that like there are lots of Christians who might believe in angels and demons and spiritual warfare in general. How many people would hold to this kind of new apostolic idea?
That's a great question. Very hard to know. So Wagner helps coin the term New Apostolic Reformation in 1996. He retires from his seminary teaching job in 1999 to build a set of networks that he also calls the New Apostolic Reformation. And there's about 7 of those networks, kind of all interlocked. And they have at their height under Wagner's leadership, maybe 1,000 leaders, prominent pastors in the charismatic world. Who are also trying out this idea of being apostles and prophets. So the NAR as NAR is a fairly specific set of leaders who attached themselves to Peter Wagner, to these networks, in the roughly 1999 to 2010 time period. So if we're talking just about the NAR as kind of who belongs to the movement, it will be there's thousands of churches attached to these folks, but it's a fairly kind of small set of networks, and it's global. I mean, some of these networks span across continents, but there's really probably tens of thousands, maybe in the low millions, who are globally who are attached to that. The ideas of the NAR have become incredibly popular in the last decade, and so people can pick up the ideas because they have this viral quality to their theology. It's not systematic theology that is written down in statements of faith that people either adopt wholesale or reject wholesale. It's these memes, it's these prophecies that get kind of attached to Donald Trump, attached to spiritual warfare, images, and then those get spread further and further throughout evangelicalism. And because these ideas have been used to justify and vindicate Donald Trump, one of the chief roles that the NAR has played in the last decade has been they've been the theological propagandists of Donald Trump, using these memes, these prophecies to popularize Donald Trump. Well, those ideas have spread with the popularity of Donald Trump among American Christians. So a colleague of mine, Paul Jupe, and I, we put a survey in the field in January just to get a sense of how far these ideas had spread. And we knew just from watching this space that these ideas were spreading rapidly. We were still shocked at the results of this survey. So we narrowed down to 7 statements that come basically out of this NAR paradigm. Things like apostles and prophets exist today and should be integral to leadership in the church. Or there are territorial spirits that control literal physical territory. Christians should organize mass campaigns of spiritual warfare to displace demons. I grew up evangelical. I even grew up a charismatic evangelical. I never heard this stuff growing up. So these were very fringe ideas, even up till about a decade ago. What we found in our survey was, out of these 7 statements that we created, on 6 out of the 7, more than 50% of American evangelicals agreed or strongly agreed with those statements. And a sizable portion of even non-evangelical Christians agreed or strongly agreed with those statements. So it varied from question to question, but it was usually in like the 30 percentile, right? So these ideas have truly gone viral. They have spread, and these leaders have become very popular. These NAR leaders, they become celebrities because they are the propagandists of Donald Trump, and so they're the people who want to attach themselves theologically to Donald Trump are usually using, sometimes at several layers of removal, some of these NAR ideas.
Okay. I wonder if we can connect that at all to the 7 Mountain Mandate, right? And so this is an idea that there's like these kind of 7 areas of culture, as far as I understand it, that kind of are important for determining who we are. And so can you explain a little bit about where that idea came from and sort of what it means to some evangelicals?
Yeah, the 7 Mountain Mandate is another kind of prophecy meme that originates within these NAR circles. It was coined by a disciple of Peter Wagner's, whose name is Lance Wallnau, Wallnau. And Lance Wallnau, he kind of was a latecomer into the NAR networks, and he had already kind of formulated this 7 Mountains idea. And then Peter Wagner embraced that idea and really liked Lance Wallnau and brought him into the inner circle of the NAR. And then the NAR networks really popularized the 7 Mountain Mandate concept. Starting around 2007 or 2008, they had a whole campaign rolling this idea out, wrote multiple books about it, and really talked about it everywhere. And it became very widespread through that. The basic concept is that you can divide society up into 7 arenas of influence: government, education, family, religion, arts and entertainment, media, commerce. And the idea is they imagine each of those arenas of influence as a mountain, and that Christians, the top of that mountain, the position of control over that area of influence, is either controlled by these demons or controlled by Christians in the kingdom of God. And so the mandate is for Christians to go and take over positions of influence in every society at every level of society. So you can talk about it's scalable. So you can talk about the 7 mountains in my city, the 7 mountains in my county. I need to help conquer the government mountain in my city. Or you can talk about it at a national level. We need to conquer the government mountain over America. And you can talk about this in every society. It's not particular to America. You can talk about the 7 mountains in Brazil, the 7 mountains in Hungary. But if then Christians are supposed to take over these positions of influence and then let Christian influence flow down into society. This is a very different approach to politics. It's a different model of social change than what most evangelicals have embraced over the last few decades. If you think about the rise of the religious right in the 1980s, the mobilization of evangelicals around Republican politics, that was usually channeled into democratic activism, right? We're the moral majority, and we need to exercise our demographic power by mobilizing Christians to vote and getting our kinds of people into office and using the mechanisms of democracy to Christianize society, right? That's a grassroots kind of evangelization, mobilization model of societal change. The 7 Mountains is a vanguard revolutionary model of change, that you take over the positions of power in society and let your influence flow down, trickle down from those positions of influence. So it's a much more revolutionary concept. And this has become really the political theology of the New Apostolic Reformation. And again, we asked a question about the 7 Mountains in our survey, and more than 50% of evangelicals said that they believe this idea, believe this concept. And that, just thinking about that for a minute, Lance Wallnau coined this phrase in 2000. So this idea is not even 25 years old. And yet more than half of American evangelicals, which 12 to 15% of Americans, are all embracing this idea. And actually it's quite a bit more than that, because many non-evangelicals also embrace the 7 Mountains. I've seen numbers north of 20% of American evangelicals embracing the 7 Mountains as a concept. That's striking, right? That this idea could so much come from the margins, but then through these diffuse networks, through social media, through attachment to Donald Trump, that has become almost a mainstream idea within American Christianity.
Yeah, that's really is striking, as you say. So I know that media is one of those mountains, and arts and entertainment is another, and those are two I'm interested in as a communications professor. If Christians are ruling in those areas, what does that look like, kind of practically?
It looks like a lot of things, actually. So one approach would be to you have Christians go in to media as a career field and to insinuate themselves into positions of influence, and then to use that influence as they understand it to bring about kind of a Christian message or a Christian conception of society. There also are a number of media outfits that are explicitly Christian that have been created to promote the 7 Mountains. And some of those are even Hollywood studios that are Christian Hollywood studios producing Christian films, but they don't always code as Christian films. Sometimes they're things like Sound of Freedom, right? This film that came out a year or two ago that's all about child trafficking, and this heroic figure. I'm going to put heroic in quotes. There's a lot of mythology in the film, but these heroic figures who are rescuing children who've been trafficked, but even though these films are often being produced by companies or by organizations that have a kind of 7 Mountains framework that they're using. Another way that it looks, though, is creating alternative media. And so there's a lot of Christian alternative media that is focused mostly on Christians and speaking to Christians, that is about kind of mobilizing Christians and using the tools of media to galvanize Christians. And some of that, this stuff is very popular. This media is very popular. You have millions, tens of millions of people tracking it. But if you are not in that Christian world or in that bubble, you might never even know about it. So the ideas spread, and it's always kind of like, if you think of, if you're a mainstream media consumer, you might never have contact with One American News Network or Breitbart unless you went seeking it out. a lot of this Christian media, especially charismatic Christian media, is similar to that. It's very siloed, speaks to huge audiences, but if you're not in that audience, you wouldn't even know about it. And ideas can go viral there and start showing up in American public life, but not be mainstream or visible to the mainstream per se.
So I know that evangelicals, kind of generally speaking, tended to embrace tools of communication as like a tool for evangelism, right? The idea of kind of converting people into believing as they do. Has the strategy changed in the face of kind of emerging media like new digital media? I know you've written about YouTube and about apps, for example. So can you maybe talk about that and maybe give a few specific examples?
Yeah, it's one of those areas where there's a lot of continuity, but also quite a bit of change in recent years. The continuity, as you're saying, evangelicals, particularly American evangelicals, have really been at the forefront of new media, really over the last 2 centuries. Going back to circuit riding preachers in the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, pamphlets, flyers, tracts, and then radio, and then television, right? Televangelism, radio evangelism. And so evangelicals, Pentecostals have been really on the front lines of adopting new media to fulfill what they understand their mission to be of evangelizing to broad audiences. And especially Christian media that people might be more familiar with, kind of televangelism networks. A lot of that is charismatic. Almost all televangelism comes out of either Pentecostal or charismatic circles. And so there's been a lot of adoption. There's dedicated channels that are propagating this stuff. What we've seen more recently is a very aggressive and intentional adoption of social media, of YouTube, of podcasts, of kind of dedicated news sources that operate. I mean, you can think about it as a kind of media bubble that can radicalize people quite rapidly, right? Because especially in some of these charismatic spaces where people believe in modern prophecy, well, if you're only listening to prophets and prophets become the vehicle through which you're getting your news, your view of the world, your view of American politics, your view of world events is going to be filtered through that media. So just to give an example, so Lance Wallnau is the guy who comes up with the Seven Mountain Mandate. Lance Wallnau meets with Donald Trump in the fall of 2015, just shortly after Trump becomes a candidate for the presidency, and Wallnau believes he receives a prophecy about Donald Trump when he meets with him at Trump Tower in the fall of 2015, and he believes that God speaks to him that Donald Trump is a type of a Cyrus, that Donald Trump has a Cyrus anointing, is how he sometimes phrases it. And Cyrus is the emperor of the Persians in the 6th century BCE. Cyrus is the figure who sends the Jewish people back from exile in Babylon. And so Wallnau attaches this to Isaiah chapter 45, this particular prophecy about Cyrus, but then links that to Donald Trump and says, well, Donald Trump will be the 45th president, and it's Isaiah 45, and Donald Trump is a Cyrus, and Cyrus is referred to using messianic language in Isaiah chapter 45. He's talked about as anointed, and that in Hebrew, the word anointed, that's where we get the term Messiah. Messiah literally translates as an anointed one, right? So Cyrus is a type of Messiah, but then connecting that into Donald Trump, Wallnau says Donald Trump is going to send conservative Christians back from our cultural exile. He's going to bring us into the mainstream, give us power, right? And so, but then those ideas get spread through Christian media, through social media. In fact, when right before the 2016 election, when news breaks about the Access Hollywood tape, Lance Wallnau has just come out with a book prophesying that Donald Trump is going to win this election. And he recognizes that this is a crisis. He's in Israel for a conference. And he goes on YouTube to basically speak to his audience. He starts doing a live stream on Facebook, but it was also broadcast on YouTube. And he does this live stream on Facebook in the fall of 2016. And in this broadcast from Israel, he says that Donald Trump, that he again, using kind of biblical language, he says that God can use the jawbone of an ass, the jawbone of a donkey, to slay 1,000 Philistines, a reference to some stories about the Samson in the Hebrew Bible. But God could never use a Jezebel. And Jezebel is the evil queen, or one of the evil queens in the Hebrew Bible. So very much an implicit, like, Hillary Clinton's a Jezebel, Donald Trump might be the jawbone of an ass, but God can use him. This video, this one Facebook video, gets 4 million people watching it before the election. That's 4 million evangelicals who are paying attention to Wallnau's reframing of the Access Hollywood tape and using biblical references. And so that is how kind of these ideas spread. It's through these kind of viral videos, these viral things. But it's also become much more formalized. So in the lead up to the 2020 election, Kenneth Copeland, who's a major televangelist, Trump advisor, creates a show on Kenneth Copeland has his own televangelism network called Victory Channel. And they create a show on there called Flashpoint. This is in September of 2020. And Flashpoint is pitched as a prophecy news commentary show. And if you watch it, it looks like cable news. It looks like you're watching cable news. You got a panel of 4 people all side by side, and they'll take turns talking. It looks like you're watching cable news, except all the people on there identify as prophets and are tying together the news of the day, the news of the week, with these prophecies that they have. And Lance Wallnau has been one of the anchors of Flashpoint ever since it was started in September of 2020. And just to give you a sense, again, of how this stuff spreads. So these Flashpoint videos, they record a couple times a week. They're getting posted on YouTube. Victory Channel, the overarching channel, had virtually no YouTube presence prior to Flashpoint launching. In September of 2020, when it launches, they maybe get 100,000 views. October of 2020, right before the election, it jumps up into the low millions. November, into the tens of millions. By January, it's 30 million YouTube views on these Flashpoint videos and on YouTube. And this is part of the propaganda campaign that is spreading out. All of these prophecies are about Trump or about the election or about fighting over whether Trump should be reinstated and what are the new prophecies about that? What are the legal wranglings? They bring people like Michael Flynn and Steve Bannon onto Flashpoint to comment on these things, right? There's a very kind of integrated media landscape that is promoting these ideas and is going viral in these particular communities. And those are the channels that are feeding people into January 6th. I've gone through the social media profiles of the Christians who show up on January 6th around the Capitol. And what you find just across the board there are these Flashpoint videos, Facebook Live videos with Lance Wallnau, Talk of the Seven Mountains, art. There's art, this prophetic art that gets created in these circles, kind of digital art that represents spiritual warfare, represents Donald Trump and spiritual warfare. And those get spread through these things. And now today, you can even see Donald Trump reposting some of these digital images of angels surrounding him or of people, of angels comforting or protecting him. He actually is reposting these. He recognizes the virality and the power of these images for endowing him with a special spiritual aura.
So I have a follow-up question then. When people are creating this kind of information, when they're spreading and sharing this kind of information, is there any evidence that it's like deliberate disinformation or misinformation, or are they completely sincere about it?
I've interviewed a lot of these folks, including some of these digital prophetic artists. Everything I can tell is they're very sincere about it. They really believe this stuff. I think in some ways their behavior is hard to explain if they weren't sincere. If they were all cynical hucksters, I'm not sure what the upside of showing up on January 6th would be. But many of them show up that day, and they're not. It's not a super public thing. You have to do a lot of digging to find what they were doing and where they were and all that. But they're showing up that day to do spiritual warfare. They're showing up that day to fulfill prophecies. And if they don't really believe it, it's a little bit hard to reconstruct a mental process that would get you there. I have access to Peter Wagner's archives that are at Fuller Seminary, and you read through those, you can see their correspondence with each other. The who they are in public is who they are in private. I'm not saying there aren't any hucksters in that world. Obviously, it's a realm that is ripe for plundering with if you were more of a cynical kind of huckster. With the NAR, though, they really believe this stuff. They really sincerely believe these prophecies. They become very popular and very powerful through them. But there's a true believer dimension to it that I think you can't factor out, because it's very important for understanding how they actually operate.
Well, then kind of following up on that, I know that there's some magnification and sort of spreading of their messages, some kind of celebrity factor that shows up sometimes, right, with certain political figures or people like Mike Flynn. How does that fit in there? Are those people also all true believers in that, or are they being opportunistic?
Yeah, that's a much harder question, actually. I try not to speculate about the sincerity or true beliefs of politicians and more true blue political activists, right? I mean, politicians, they've got a lot of cross-pressured reasons for doing what they do, for speaking to different audiences, for saying different things to different audiences. It's very hard. I have no idea what Donald Trump thinks of all these prophecies. You can see videos of prophets prophesying over him in person, including Lance Wallnau and others of these figures. And Trump kind of stands there and receives it and listens to it and seems to smile and nod along. Does he believe that? I have no idea, right? It's very hard to get inside his head. And similarly, like somebody like Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn, I don't know what they actually believe. I suspect some of them actually do really believe it, especially for folks who are prone to conspiratorial thinking. It's not a huge leap from saying, oh, I believe the QAnon prophet to I believe these charismatic prophets. That's not a huge intellectual leap. I'm sure that some of them are manipulating. Just to give an example, Roger Stone, one of Trump's closest advisors, real kind of political dirty trickster from the Nixon era, he claims that he was born again in 2020 at a Franklin Graham evangelistic event. And he claims that he has had these different charismatic experiences. And now he goes around speaking at places like the Reawaken America tour with Michael Flynn, or speaking on these dedicated charismatic media podcasts or channels. And so he'll say things like, well, I, Roger Stone, had a vision of a demonic portal opening up over Joe Biden's White House and saw demons kind of going back and forth into the White House. Does he really believe that? Did he really experience it? I have no idea. It sounds to me pretty cynical. It sounds to like, knowing Roger Stone's history, that sounds to me like he's found a new audience to manipulate, and he's trying to kind of speak their lingo and doing a pretty ham-handed job at it. I don't know. and I think we always have to realize too that all of these people are human, and humans have a remarkable capacity for self-deception, for that, right? I mean, you can go back to the philosopher David Hume, right? The reality is not this kind of thing that gets mirrored in our brain. Our brains are doing a lot of activity, processing the sensory data that is coming in, interpreting that data, even reconfiguring that data internal to our brains. So everyone's the hero of their own narrative. I wouldn't be shocked to learn that Roger Stone really believes this stuff. But again, I'm not really even sure how you assess that, because if he's lying, he's going to keep lying, right? So it's very, very hard to get into the minds of politicians or political activists with all their kind of different pressures, different things. These leaders who I've interviewed, as far as I can tell, they are true believers.
Okay. So my final question. I feel like a lot of the media coverage of these groups sort of treats them like a curiosity, right? When you see a guy blowing a shofar, on the lawn of the Capitol, or you see people laying on hands in prayer, something maybe you're not as familiar with. And so I'm guessing that this is kind of a result of there being a lot fewer reporters overall. So there's fewer reporters who have a lot of training or understanding in religion or experience on a religion beat. Do you think that this is something the media could benefit from paying more attention to?
Absolutely. In fact, I think our understanding of American politics is impoverished if we don't understand what's going on in these circles, because these are the circles where devotion to Donald Trump is growing and spreading and radicalizing, frankly, a lot of Christians. And I think I talked to a lot of reporters. I've probably talked to dozens, maybe scores of reporters in the last year and a half. And I think there's kind of an overlapping set of problems when it comes to this. One problem is internal to the media industry, the journalism industry, and that is that so many of these local papers, including local papers where somebody had the religion beat and their job was just to go cover religion, those jobs are gone. I mean, there are still there are a handful of dedicated religion beat reporters at big media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, but most reporters are jacks of all trades now. And most reporters, again, kind of another factor internal to the journalism industry, is that most reporters come from fairly elite backgrounds. And so if they have a Christian background, it's probably not a Pentecostal charismatic Christian background. There's a few, I've encountered a few reporters who have background and stuff, and when they see it, they know exactly what they're looking at. But a lot of reporters have never even touched this world. And so they see it as an oddity, a curiosity, a kind of bizarre fringe dimension of American Christianity instead of something that has become incredibly mainstream. And then they tend, the folks who do focus on this tend to be people who focus and have their beat around politics, and so or economics, and so they're interpreting it through economic and political lenses, and doing so, I would say, with a baseline of kind of cynicism, to say, like, these people can't possibly believe in territorial spirits. They can't this must just be manipulation. And that coverage, I think, really does misinform the public about the real motivations, the real depth of belief that exists in these circles, and the danger that it poses. I think I would sleep a little better if these people that I study were all cynical hucksters, because cynical hucksters are pretty predictable, right? They want money, they want fame, they want power. And whatever's going to give them a path to that, you can kind of see where they're going to go. True believers who believe in modern prophecy, well, there are a lot of wild cards in that, in terms of where they could go, what direction they could go. And I think you can't understand what happens on January 6th, particularly the Christian manifestations that happen on January 6th, without understanding that kind of siloed radicalization that can go on when a particular set of religious actors who have very charismatic, in every sense of that word, religious leaders pushing them, saying, we have prophecies, we have certainty, we have revelation from God that Donald Trump is supposed to be the president. And we need to make that happen, because we need to fulfill these prophecies so that the kingdom of God can move forward. When you attach that kind of authority and that kind of epistemology, that kind of how you know what you know, to a religious figure or religious party, that's a very dangerous formula for political and religious radicalization. And it's very unpredictable what these folks will do. So I think, fortunately, more and more reporters are paying attention and are really trying to get these stories right, are trying to dig into them. We need more of it. We need more scholars working in these areas, because even scholars have tended to sidestep a lot of this stuff because it seems really kind of lowbrow. We need more scholarship. We need more reporting. We need more exposure of this. Part of the reason that January 6th surprised so many people is we weren't paying attention to the right communities. And some of the leaders that I follow and who were instrumental to what happened on January 6th, you cannot find their name mentioned in mainstream media in the period between any time in 2020 or 2021, because they weren't on the radar of most mainstream media outlets, and yet their influence was incredibly powerful. And we know that some of them were working in coordination with the White House. So Trump and the Trump administration was aware of the demographic and cultural power these folks held, It was the kind of mainstream media and the elites that weren't aware of it.
It's a good lesson for everybody then. All right. I know that you have other resources, documentaries you've put together, podcasts, those kind of things, and you have a book coming out. Can you talk a little bit about the book? What's it about? When can we get it? Where?
So I'll do the whole pitch. So we created really three kind of different ways of engaging with some of my scholarship on this, just because I realize this stuff is very hard to kind of get your head around. So we created a 25-minute documentary on YouTube that's called Spiritual Warriors, Decoding Christian Nationalism of the Capitol Riot. It's free. It's on YouTube. If you just search Spiritual Warriors, you can find it. And that really will give you a sense of some of how this build up to January 6th worked and what role the NAR played in that. I did an audio documentary podcast series called Charismatic Revival Fury. That's about 7.5 hours that really goes through. And we integrate a lot of audio clips from these NAR leaders, so you can hear in their own voices how they're gearing people up for January 6th, what they're doing on January 6th, and kind of understand the theological kind of rationale for that. And then my book, which it comes out in September, it's available for pre-order now, is called The Violent Take It by Force. And then the subtitle is The Christian Movement That's Threatening Our Democracy. And in the book, I try to give a history of the NAR and key leaders in the NAR, but also to situate all of this within this broader tectonic shift that we are experiencing right now in the culture, the spirituality, the leadership of the religious right in America. And part of what I'm trying to show in the book is many people think they understand the religious right because they understand it from the 1980s or the 1990s, and they've got Jerry Falwell and Ralph Reed and some of these names in their mind, and they're like, oh, I understand how that works. It's functioning very differently today because of these ascendant charismatic paradigms, because of these apostles and prophets, because of the inner circle that was around Donald Trump and the influence that they are wielding. It's looking very different today. It's functioning very different today. And it also is carrying a premium of radicalization that was not present in many of these circles in the 1980s and 1990s. And so part of the book is looking back at January 6th, but it's also warning about the threat that this poses. It's not a historical threat, right? January 6th was not a one and done kind of event. In fact, January 6th was in many ways an early peak of this movement, and it's continued to climb and rise. And the leaders that I write about in the book are more popular today than they were on January 6th. The ideas are more popular today than they were on January 6th. And more Christians in America are getting radicalized by these ideas, radicalized by this quasi-messianic attachment to Donald Trump. And we are coming up upon another election that I am very worried we will see fairly widespread political violence, often inflected with Christianity and charismatic Christianity, and that could make January 6th look like a cakewalk if things get out of control.
You're right. Well, on that happy note.
Sorry, I appreciate not a cheerful reflection, I realize, but I would love to be wrong. I would absolutely love to be wrong. If we speak a year from now and it's like, wow, the 2024 election just went swimmingly and everything went smoothly, and I would be so happy. But I think we need to be aware of the ingredients that are in place for real political violence in the near future.
All right. Well, thank you so much for visiting with us on Unspun this week.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.